to episode 2 of our CRICKETher social isolation podcasts. We've gone into full lockdown in the UK this week, so we actually haven't left the house at all except to go running. And in terms of this week's episode, the people have spoken. We ran a poll on Twitter to see where you wanted us to be this week. And where are we, Sid?
We're at Lord's. But the real question is, when are we? If you can guess when we are, then let us know. See who can get it.
Okay. Favourite memory of Lord's, Sid?
Oh gosh, well, there's been some good memories of Lord's for me. Actually, I attended my first proper cricket match at Lord's, which was a men's match back when I was quite little, back a few years ago. It was actually 1984, I think. I saw Gordon Greenwich score a double century for the West Indies against England at Lord's, so that was my first experience of it.
A bit of men's cricket there.
Yeah.
And my first experience of watching a professional cricket match was also at Lord's. My dad took me when I was about 11 or 12 to see a men's county match. It was Middlesex against Sussex, and I'm a little bit younger than you, Sid, so this would have been
just a tad.
This would have been in Andrew Strauss's pre-England days. So yeah, and obviously we've had the brilliant 2017 final for the women most recently.
Yeah.
So that was a pretty good day.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so we're going to start this week with news this week. So the ICC have issued a statement about the coronavirus, Sid.
Yeah, they had a board meeting. I guess they, got out their phones and went onto House Party or Zoom or... and then they issued a really brief statement, which honestly didn't really say very much. It said, they remain hopeful that cricket will get back on as soon as possible, and they're all doing their best, which is all they can do under the circumstances. So it's not a lot, but they're still meeting, and they're obviously still keeping in touch and still trying to keep abreast of the situation. And we'll have to just see what happens.
Mm-hmm. Okay. There was also a great piece by Vish in The Independent this week, and that was an interview with Lauren Winfield that revealed that she's recently got married to her partner, rugby league player and former Brisbane Heat cricketer Courtney Hills. So congratulations to both of them. That's really lovely news.
Yeah, it's nice things to happen in the times of coronavirus, I guess.
Yeah, definitely. And last bit of news this week, we've learned that in Melbourne, where they're currently extending the metro, a boring machine has been named after Meg Lanning. So, make of that what you will.
Insert your own joke here.
And there ends the news this week. So we thought that we'd focus our discussion this week on what the season might look like for women's cricket. So we're going to talk about various different things kind of under that heading. Perhaps we could start by talking about these 8 new centres of excellence, Sid, which we knew had been announced that they were going to be being launched, and they were meant to really be kind of starting business in April, which is only a few days away. So we understand that the appointments for the new regional directors of women's cricket have all been made now. And in terms of who we know is filling those jobs, we've got Richard Bedbrook for London and the South East, Laura McLeod for the West Midlands, and Lisa Paget for the West and Wales, which is going to be known as the Western Storm. So they're taking over that mantle. So those appointments we think have all been made, even though we don't know who some of them are. What else do we or don't we know, Sid? What's the situation currently for the COEs?
Well, not a lot, if that seems to possibly be a theme of the day. They're clearly behind where they want to, and I think this is nothing to do with coronavirus. The issue that the ECB have, as we've mentioned before, is that they've undertaken probably the biggest project in their history as an organisation, which is the 100. They've never done anything like this. In such a short space of time, they've dedicated all their resources to it, and so unsurprisingly, the COEs These things, it's not easy to set up a new business, and these are setting up new businesses. And there's all sorts of complications that come along, and it's not a straightforward thing to do. So unsurprisingly, they're a little bit behind, even regardless of the current situation. So we were hoping that they'd have players, pretty much in place by now. That's obviously not quite the case. I mean, some players have definitely been, informally told, that they will be expecting, a contract through the post. But we have nothing official on that. Of course,
so we've been promised the 40 new domestic contracts, haven't we? And we haven't heard any of the people who have been allocated contracts, and I think they were meant to actually be starting in April. So they're a bit behind with that. We don't know any of the brand names other than I've just mentioned Western Storm. But in terms of these new centres of excellence actually being kind of brands in their own right and having their own team names separate from the counties, we don't know anything about that.
Yeah, there's still some way to go, but I think the good news is that they've got up until September to sort themselves out. So they're not expected to be actually playing any cricket before September. And there's certainly, and we'll discuss this a little bit later, but there certainly are hopes that there will be some cricket at the end of the summer this summer. So all that stuff could still happen. There's still got time to do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we have had a couple of queries about the COEs on Twitter, and the real response is that we don't know any more than you at the moment, but that they are a bit behind, we think. Okay, what about 50 over county cricket this summer, Sid? Because at the end of last season, the ECB took the unprecedented step of abolishing the Women's County Championship, and the idea was that domestically we would have a county T20 Cup taking place at the start of the season, but that then all the 50 over stuff would be based at the centres of excellence. But that's not actually going to be the case, is it?
Well, no, we've had some kind of positive news from there, in that we're starting to see. As we said that there might be last season, a couple of people said they wanted to carry on playing county cricket, and we've started to see these competitions emerging. So we've had a couple of announcements in the last couple of weeks, haven't we? One from the east of England and one from the so-called London counties.
Yeah, so there's going to be a London Women's County Championship with Middlesex, Surrey, Essex and Kent taking part. And we also published a great interview this week, or a piece this week, where we'd spoken to Phil Lewis about the new East of England Women's County Championship, which is going to be Buckinghamshire, Hertfordshire, Huntingdonshire and Norfolk coming together, and they're going to be playing 50 over fixtures against each other as well.
Yeah, I think these two are kind of quite different beasts in some ways. The East of England Championship, they're teams that were in the lower reaches of the county championship, and they're really largely players that will have no real aspirations of ever playing for England or anything like that. There may be some young players that on those teams that will one day move counties and play for England, but largely those are made up with people that are playing for the love of the game and for the love of representing their county. And in that case, those people really wanted to carry on for those kinds of reasons. They saw that there wasn't really the foundation in terms of club cricket to sustain a decent standard there, so they wanted to carry on playing, and that really very much came from the women that are playing for those counties, the demand to carry on doing that. The London Championship's a little bit different, because obviously there'll be plenty of players in there that will still have aspirations of playing professionally and being part of the centres of excellence and one day playing for England. So that's going to be quite a competition, actually. There's going to be a very high standard of cricket there, so that's definitely one to look forward to.
It's going to be really interesting, isn't it, to see whether we see any England players playing in that London Championship, because on the one hand, actually, while the ECB have now said, according to the George DeBell piece on CRICKETher, that they support this London Championship, it does seem that they've potentially been kind of forced into that from a position of reluctance. But having said that, they would be massively shooting themselves in the foot if they said that somebody like Nat Siver can't play these 50 over fixtures, given that we've got a 50 over World Cup coming up in New Zealand in 2021. And you'd imagine that, say, Lisa Kiteley wouldn't be too happy if the ECB tried to block one of her players playing competitive 50 over cricket. So I think that will be really interesting to see. And the other point, I guess, to make on this is kind of in relation to that, is that actually it does feel like the ECB underestimated the importance of women's county cricket to a lot of players, to a lot of coaches, and to the kind of county clubs themselves. So for a Surrey, they're obviously, as a professional club, they want to keep running a women's team, a women's county team. That's an important part of their identity as a club. And then for these players who are playing for the likes of Norfolk and Huntingdonshire, it's the fact that they've worked their way up through the county age group teams, and that the kind of point of all that is to then go on and represent your senior women's county team, and to try and take that away from you actually and say, oh well, you can just go and play club cricket. It's fundamentally not the same thing. It's a very important kind of badge of honour as a player to say, well, I represent my county team.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's what they deserve, I think. So I'm really pleased for them, and I'm pleased to see these competitions springing up. It's worth adding that that these things are being self-funded by these counties. We're not draining money from anything else by doing this and supporting this. The East of England folks have actually gone out there and pounded the streets and found sponsorship for their competition. I'm guessing that in the East of England one in particular, then players will have to make some contribution themselves one way or another. But if people want to do that, then you shouldn't be trying to stop them.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess it just feels like things in terms of the way that county and club cricket will work going forward is going to actually pan out a little bit differently to how the ECB maybe would have expected it to, or wanted it to. So it's just very interesting. It's going to be a very interesting development. I guess we should move on and think about the kind of elephant in the room, which is...
Where's the elephant? Oh, sorry.
It's coronavirus.
It's behind the camera,
guys. You can't
guys.
see it. It's coronavirus. So, yeah, how is that going to affect our season? There's been quite a lot of pieces written and talk about how it might affect the men's season and the men's county season in particular. How might it affect things for us, Sid?
Well, officially, the folks at the ECB still remain hopeful that they can implement a large chunk of the calendar, and I think that kind of from a professional perspective, they've got to remain hopeful of that. If only because admitting that the season is going out the door and has run off with the neighbour's wife is going to have a whole lot of other knock-on consequences about what you do about paying people's salaries, things like that. So the ECB have to remain professionally optimistic, and they're still hopeful that they can play the Women's International Series. They're still hopeful that they can play some of the Men's International calendar. Mm-hmm. They're still hopeful that they can play the 100. How realistic this is kind of obviously an unknown quantity, and that none of us really know what we're in for here, or how long this is going to go on. And I think that everyone is going to be supportive of a situation that saves lives, and if we have to miss the first 2 months of the cricket season in order to pursue this lockdown that at the end of the day is supposed to save tens of thousands of people's lives in this country, then that's what we've got to do. It does currently look like the Women's T20 Cup is probably pretty unlikely to happen, just because the government are talking about the lockdown being several weeks rather than just a couple of weeks. So that's probably not going to happen. But I guess the huge questions are what happens to the rest of the calendar and whether there are knock-on effects of anything. So, can they still run the 100? Can they still compress the 100 into a short format if the lockdowns end? How realistic is it to have international teams coming over here? How realistic is it to play other forms of cricket? At the moment,
about this thing about that they've said about it's been mooted as a possibility in The Guardian this week about the idea of playing some internationals, and this was specifically focusing on men's internationals, kind of behind closed doors, so that you have a sort of sealed, sterile environment around the two teams, and you don't have a crowd, basically, but people can still watch it on TV. Is that realistic for the women's game?
I personally don't feel that that's going to be particularly realistic. I'm not really sure that it's possible to actually have that sterile environment, and you'd have to test everybody that was participating in it. There are quite a lot of people involved, even in a women's international, let alone a men's international, and to think that none of them would be able to, how do you seal those people off, particularly as we know the virus, somebody can have the virus for several days before they show any symptoms. And obviously we're hopeful that we can get a test in place, as in a test for the virus rather than a test cricket. That would be a fine thing as far as the women were concerned. So we're hopeful that we can get a test for the virus in place, but whether it's really realistic to test everybody. And the issue comes down with, what happens if you wake up on the morning of the game and one of the players in your team has the virus?
Yeah.
Then in theory, right now, you've got to pretty much lock down the whole thing, and then it's all off. And those same questions are going to come about, over the 100 as well. Unless there's a big change in what we can do in response to the virus, and we always remain hopeful that that some researcher somewhere might wake up with a cure tomorrow morning, which would obviously be the miracle that we're all kind of reaching out for. But right now, that doesn't feel particularly hopeful. So, again, I can see why the ECB professionally are trying to make plans and find solutions, but I feel personally quite pessimistic that these solutions are remotely realistic.
It certainly feels like the 100 is probably the thing that's least likely to happen this summer in some ways. And the reason I say that is because it's meant to be this exciting new big event, and its entire purpose is to try and attract new people to cricket and new people to come to cricket matches. And it kind of feels like playing it behind closed doors would sort of defeat the object in a way, and it's going to be very disappointing for a lot of people who have worked really hard if it can't take place this summer. But it will be equally disappointing if it has to go ahead in some kind of very limited capacity with a very diminished number of international players, for example. Of overseas international players. So the other thing is trying to put a women's 100 team in some kind of very limited, sterile way. Do they actually have the resources to do that? Because the women's teams are going to be operating, you feel like, on a much more limited budget than the men's teams. Yeah. Have they really got the money to put them all up in these sterile hotels and, say a match at Sedbergh School? How on earth is that going to happen? Are you going to make Sedbergh School an entirely sterile environment somehow? Or, it feels like that's easier to do when you're playing at these big grounds that have lots of facilities in place, and when you're dealing with men's teams where we know that the budgets are much bigger than for the women's 100.
Yeah, there are going to be, there are all sorts of those questions. But I guess the bottom line is that we just don't know at this stage. But, if I were them, I'd be feeling privately quite pessimistic. And I suspect, actually, they probably are feeling privately quite pessimistic while maintaining that positive public face.
I mean, I think the other thing that we've heard, I think it was just today, that's slightly concerning, is this idea that obviously the ECB stand to lose quite a lot of money if lots of fixtures have to be cancelled. And that therefore that means that this new £20 million investment in women and girls cricket as part of the ECB's new strategy might be at threat. Now, we haven't had anything to confirm that yet, we should say, so that this is purely speculation at this stage. But I do feel worried that when the chips are down, the first thing on the table for the chop is going to be that.
Yeah, again, it's more difficult questions for the bosses to answer. I noticed this morning in the newspapers as well that men's rugby union has taken some very difficult steps, and they look like they're going to furlough all their players, which is going to mean enormous pay cuts for those players, because those furloughs are limited to £2,500 per month per employee. So if you're a rugby union player on £120,000 a year, then suddenly you're going to have an absolutely enormous drop in your salary. And obviously nobody wants to do that, but they're the difficult choices that may have to be taken. And the ECB collectively with the men's counties may also wind up having to take some of those difficult choices. Obviously, if they were to furlough the international players, that would mean that the women would actually in some ways do much better than the men, because the women would maintain in almost all cases 80% of their salary, whereas the men would drop precipitously. But, so unfortunately, somebody out there is going to have to take some very difficult choices over the next few months in order that the game as a whole can survive.
Slightly more positively, it does feel, in a way, more likely that we will see some women's county cricket this summer than potentially some men's county cricket, in the sense of that obviously the men's county game is professional and may involve a much greater number of people and kind of crowds and things like that, and having to deal with that, whereas the women's county game is recreational. So I think it's potentially quite likely that at the back end of the season, so August and September, we could see some of these London Championships, East of England Championships, actually having some of their fixtures going ahead, because recreational sport is going to be something that's allowed and permitted a lot more quickly than by the government than professional sport. That's my inkling anyway.
Yeah, and potentially the Centres of Excellence competition could go ahead under similar circumstances that could effectively be played behind closed doors. I mean, frankly, it's likely to be played behind fairly closed doors anyway. It's likely to have attendances similar to the county championship. So I think that by the time we get through to September, if things go positively in terms of the situation, then we could be seeing the Centres of Excellence happen as well. And if the international tours don't happen, then that becomes even more important in terms of preparation for the World Cup next year, which we are all still hopeful will go ahead. I think there are concerns potentially about the men's T20 World Cup, which is scheduled to take place several months earlier, but the women's 50 over World Cup, hopefully we'll all be through this and we won't be doing any more social isolation vodcasts.
No, we can revert back to our normal, boring, non-isolation podcasts. But yeah, let's try and end on a bit of a positive note. There is a light at the end of this tunnel. We will get through it, and there may even be some cricket at the end of this summer. So we're keeping our fingers crossed and we're hopeful. And I guess the other light at the end of our particular tunnel, Sid, is we announced a nice bit of news on Twitter this week, didn't we?
We did. So when we were over in Australia for the T20 World Cup, I popped the question to Raf, and she said,
Yes. Of course. Do you think people knew we were a couple?
I think they probably did.
Thank
you so much to everyone on Twitter that sent their best wishes.
It was really nice.
That's wonderful. And I don't think there'll be any dates set in the immediate future.
No, we're not. I'm using some of the time to think about nice plans, positive plans. Yeah, but we're not setting dates or anything yet. But yeah, so it was really nice to get all your messages, and it was nice to have people say that they'd enjoyed hearing a bit of good news in the middle of lots of bad news and scary times in the world outside. So am I allowed to tell them the story, Sid, about how you popped the question?
If you want.
Okay, well, I honestly had no idea that Sid was going to propose. We'd spent the day in Sydney. We went we went up on the bridge, and we did various other touristy things, and then we went to this very touristy pub called the Australian, which does very touristy pizzas, and they have a crocodile pizza, and they have a kangaroo pizza, and an emu pizza. And I had the kangaroo and emu pizza. Sid's vegetarian, so he just had the normal boring margarita. And so we had this pizza, and I spent ages picking all the meat off it, because emu meat is not well. The way that it was cooked wasn't particularly nice. And then we went to the zoo the next day, and I felt really guilty because there were some really cute emus and kangaroos, and I'd been eating them the day before. Anyway, so this is just setting the scene for how completely unexpected the whole thing was. After we finished our pizza, Sid said, "Oh, shall we go for a walk by the Opera House with the bridge in the background?" And I was a bit like, "Oh, I thought we'd just go back to our hotel because, we're both a bit tired." And you were like, "No." So we went for this walk, and then I was like, "Oh, let's take a photo." And you were like, "No, let's just go and sit on this bench." I was like, "Why?" So we went and sat on this bench, and then you said, "Close your eyes, Raf." So I closed my eyes, and at that point I was a bit like, And then I opened them, and you'd pulled the ring box out, And you gave it to me. And I was like, go on then, ask me then. So you did.
So I did.
And I said yes. And it was very lovely. And then we watched the sunset. And it was just, yeah, it was very lovely. And we're very excited and I guess happy, hopefully. Well, I am.
Yeah.
Okay. So, yeah, we'll wrap up there, I guess. But thanks for tuning in. As ever, if you have any comments or feedback, then do get in touch, or questions that you'd like us to ask, then we're going to be doing these for the foreseeable future every week. So yeah, stay safe and well.